For most of the 20th century, doctors knew stomach ulcers were caused by stress and personality. It was settled science. Then, two Australian researchers noticed something strange. Bacteria repeatedly appeared in the stomachs of ulcer patients. Over time, multiple lines of evidence began to converge. Biopsies, cultures, patient studies, and finally, successful antibiotic treatments. As these findings accumulated, the old explanation collapsed. Ulcers, it turns out, aren't caused by stress, they're caused by infection. In 2005, the discovery earned the researchers the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Sometimes we discover a widely accepted explanation isn't true, not because of one dramatic test, but because many independent facts stop fitting the story. That's the kind of problem the story of Jesus presents. Many people understandably assume that the resurrection just didn't happen. The question is, what do the facts actually point to? Hi, I'm Seth Freeman, and this is the Resurrection Now, one of the best evidenced events in history. Last time, we started building an eight-legged tower of evidence for the resurrection. Not one line of evidence, but several that have come into focus in recent decades. We looked at two of them. First, the minimal facts that most secular historians now agree on, and second, the disciples' radical change in worldview. Now we're going to look at the next several lines of evidence and see whether any explanation fits them as well as the resurrection does. The next leg of the eight-legged tower is embarrassment in the written accounts. This leg is not new in and of itself. What is new is how much weight it adds to a cumulative case. The Gospels include many passages about the resurrection that are awkward, damaging to reputations, or that seem to hurt credibility. Historians and lawyers treat embarrassing details like these as signs of truthfulness. As historian Richard J. Evans notes in his book Defense of History, historians tend to trust testimony that goes against the interests of the person giving it. If someone admits to something that would get them into trouble or lowers their own status, they're probably telling the truth. The same principle appears in law. While hearsay is usually inadmissible, courts do admit statements against interest because people rarely invent things that make themselves look bad. So, what are some of the embarrassing features of the gospel accounts? The disciples abandoned Jesus and fled the night before he was crucified. Jesus was humiliated and executed, dying in despair. Women were the first witnesses, even though women's testimony carried little or no legal weight in first century Judea. Several disciples didn't even recognize the risen Jesus at first. Some of the disciples continued to doubt, even after the first appearances. Even after seeing the risen Christ, the disciples didn't immediately preach that he'd risen. They went fishing. Jesus rebuked the disciples for their lack of belief after he appeared to them. And the risen Jesus appears strikingly ordinary, eating fish, cooking breakfast, hardly the stuff of legend. Taken together, these are not the kind of details one invents to promote a movement. Their awkwardness is best explained as actual events remembered because they actually happened. The fourth leg of the eight-legged tower is the early Christian creeds. A creed is a brief, fixed summary of core beliefs, often memorized or recited. Recent scholarship shows there simply wasn't enough time for the resurrection claim to arise from legend. Classical historian A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford reached a similar conclusion. Even 2 generations are too short a span to allow the mythical tendencies to prevail over the hard historical core of the oral tradition. He showed this across history, from Roman emperors to King Arthur. Experts on legend and myth agree. The gospel accounts do not behave like myths. As J.R.R. Tolkien, a leading scholar of myth, put it, the Gospels are not legendary or mythical in the sense in which myths are often understood. The Gospels tell a story that is much more concrete and grounded in historical reality. They are not made-up stories, but real events that happened in time. Likewise, celebrated expert of myth Joseph Campbell put it this way: the difference between the myth and the gospel story is that the Gospels present something more than a simple symbolic truth. They present a historical reality. Now consider the timing. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians recites an early creed describing the resurrection. It was written around 55 CE. There he writes, "For what I receive I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, Peter, and then to the 12. Crucially, Paul says he received this tradition earlier. Michael Goulder, an atheist New Testament scholar, says Paul's statement about the resurrection goes back at least to what Paul was taught when he was converted a couple of years after the crucifixion. And Gerd Ludermann, a German New Testament scholar and atheist, says this: the elements in the tradition, that is, the resurrection creed, are to be dated to the first 2 years after the resurrection of Jesus. Many, perhaps most, secular scholars agree. Resurrection was proclaimed too early to be legend. In short, the speed and specificity of the early Christian creeds is strongly consistent with the inference they are recording actual memory of the resurrection, not legend. The fifth leg of the eight-legged tower is the witness's character transformation. Again, this is not new in isolation. Its force comes from how well it fits the other evidence. Something caused the disciples to quickly transform from grief and fear to bold proclamation. Within weeks of Jesus' execution, the same disciples who had fled in fear were publicly proclaiming his resurrection, risking beatings, imprisonment, and death. Multiple sources attest that early Christian leaders willingly faced martyrdom without recanting their resurrection testimony. As Bart Ehrman puts it, it is a historical fact that some of the disciples came to believe that Jesus had been raised and were willing to die for that belief. Contrast that with Galileo, who recanted under threat of execution. The disciples, facing a similar threat for claiming they saw the resurrected Jesus, did not recant. At least 6 other first-century CE messianic movements died when their leaders died, but the Jesus movement did not. Why? Notice a distinction. The disciples were not ideological fanatics dying for abstract beliefs. They were witnesses defending a specific public falsifiable claim. Extremist movements rely on coercion, ideology, and insulation from evidence. The disciples did not. Secular historians generally treat them not as fanatics, but as sincere, psychologically ordinary people responding to experiences they believed were real. Nor does conspiracy explain it. Keeping a deliberate lie secret under threat of death is extraordinarily unlikely. As former Watergate conspirator Chuck Colson put it, Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me the 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. In short, as Dr. William Lane Craig puts it, the transformation of the disciples is one of the strongest evidences for the resurrection. They went from fearful individuals to bold witnesses. The sixth leg of our eight-legged tower is the gospel's accuracy about small details. Now, strictly speaking, this is more of a foundation than a leg, but 7 legs and a foundation is frankly harder to remember. How do detectives and historians assess extraordinary claims? They begin with small, mundane, checkable details, the hardest things to fabricate convincingly. When those details are consistently correct, investigators see increased baseline credibility. The same method applies to ancient texts. Credibility grows from accurate incidental details. Recent secular scholarship has tested the Gospels in exactly the same way. Their work includes these findings about names. The distribution of names in the Gospels closely matches first century Judea. Geography, towns, roads, and landmarks align with archaeological findings. Politics and law, descriptions of Roman and Jewish governance are precise. Titles, official titles for rulers and officials are consistently accurate. And manuscripts, early copies are numerous, stable, and traceable. Investigators also know that vivid but irrelevant details are strong markers of actual memory too. The Gospels also include many passages that are irrelevant, signs of actual memory. There are dozens of examples. To name just three, a naked young man fled from Gethsemane the night Jesus was arrested there. The exact number of fish the disciples caught was 153, and Peter put on his outer garment before jumping into the water. Now, individually, none of these details establish anything miraculous about Jesus, but collectively, they undermine the late legend hypothesis and support early informed testimony. We've now seen 6 of the legs of our 8-legged tower of evidence for the resurrection. You don't have to master every detail. Just notice this. The best explanations in real life are the ones that make the most facts fall into place at once without multiplying explanations. The resurrection explains all that. Alternative explanations don't. Now we want to turn to the 7th leg of the tower, possible smoking gun evidence that gives extraordinary weight to the case. That's coming up in Part 3. Expect striking scientific and historical evidence that relies on cutting-edge technology, work by experts in over 100 technical fields, and remarkable data that together reveals things you've probably never seen before. Here then is an afterword. I once met a Christian minister I'll call Pastor Steve, who ran a food bank and drug alcohol treatment center. One day he was standing in the parking lot outside his church when a young man came up to him, pulled out a gun, and shot him point blank. On the way to the hospital, Pastor Steve bled 90% of his blood onto the ambulance floor. All the way to the hospital, he prayed for his would-be murderer. His entire life was turned upside down. Meanwhile, the young man was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. When Pastor Steve had sufficiently recovered, he visited the young man in prison 6 separate times, and he told the young man this: "When you leave prison, I want you to come to my treatment program, and I promise you, by the time we're done, you and I will be good friends."